Security has always been a main focus around access to resources. And in the past, you might have been using permissions, and there were some significant challenges that we've identified in other recordings about the old model of Kerberos and NTLM. We talked about identities of authentication and authorization. In the identities model, we looked at the authentication, proving who you are, whether it be a user account or any of the identities that we now support of devices and applications and system assigned managed identities, a wide variety. We're going to take a look at security in a fundamentally different way as it exists in the cloud solution using a term called RBAC, or role-based access control. My name is Bob Tickleman, and I'm excited to be your guide in this module. When we take a look at RBAC, we want to take a look at the main difference between the different types. I've shown, and I will show in this module, the resource management and the identity management components inside of your Azure tenant. We have some specific roles, and we'll see how they differ depending for identity management versus resource management. We're going to take a look at this thing called a role definition. We're going to then define that to an assignment, a term called a scope, and see how this hierarchical structure of identity and access control is going to play across the cloud. I'm going to start off by going to a whiteboard session, and then we'll come back to the content itself. So hopefully this image is familiar to you, that you've seen in other recordings when we talked about how a tenant governance is actually built inside of Azure. And we're going to focus again on identity management versus resource management. There is RBAC applied to both, but you have to understand that there is a fundamental difference of the roles that you'll see in a minute that are defined inside of your Enter ID versus the resource management you're working with. So we saw that inside of Azure, you have a one-to-one relationship between the tenant and your tenant directory. And we're going to go take a look at the roles there first, and then we're going to jump over and take a look at the roles for resource management. Now, one of the fundamental differences that has happened inside of Azure is what we work with. In the past, we talked about permissions in things called access control lists with access control entries. We talked about tokens. And you might have seen this image in a previous recording where we talked about the Kerberos model of having access control lists, or ACLs, and having ACEs, the access control entries. This is how permissions used to work. They fundamentally have changed. We still have permissions, but we are going to work with them in a different component in this term called RBAC. Role-based access control is based on three bubbles. What we'll call who, what, and where. The who becomes those identities that we've talked about. Identities can be users, they could be groups, they could be devices, but identities become the who. The who then get assigned a what, and these become terms called roles. Now, a role is not a type of permission. We have things like a global administrator as a role. You'll see in the demonstration that I do on the portal that a role could have hundreds, if not thousands, of permissions assigned to the role. Now, there are two types of roles. We have built-in and we have custom. You can build your own roles. You can take a built-in role and copy it and add or deprecate permissions to it as you require. I've done some work in some very secure locations where they don't want somebody automatically or losing a permission that was granted to the role. So what they have to do is go through an audit process because the built-in roles are managed by Microsoft. As we add or deprecate services from Azure, we may add or deprecate permissions to a role. So what they want to go through is a very strict audit process. They copy our roles, maybe even match them 100%. And then as we change the role, they go through a change control process to either add or remove those permissions at the role level. The where becomes a term called a scope. Now, we've talked about these scopes before. They are at the tenant level. Below a tenant, you get the management groups. Below the management groups, you get the subscriptions. Below the subscriptions, you get the resource groups. And below the resource groups, you get the resources. So that component of an identity, a who, assigned to a what, a role, assigned to a scope, a where, is how permissions are going to be allocated at either the tenant level for resource management or at the tenant level for account management. Now, I'll be doing this inside of the portal in a few minutes, but if you take a look at the management group, you can see I've got one of these hierarchical management groups. I've got many different levels. But if you come in and you take a look at the access control for that management group, you're going to see that I now have a set of roles: owner, contributor, reader. Now, from an eye-winking moment, from an exam perspective, there are 3 built-in roles that you should be familiar with, and I'll say a 4th. The 4 roles are owner, contributor, reader, and what I'll classify as a custom role. So any other role other than those 3. A reader, by definition, has read access to be able to consume the resource that it's applied to, either at the identity side or at the resource management side. So if you are a reader, you can consume that resource. You can't change it, you can't delete it, you can't modify it, you can consume it. As a contributor, you basically have read-write access. You're going to have everything that you need to do to manage the object, except change the permissions on the object. You can add it, you can delete it, you can modify it, you can do everything, but you can't change the permissions on the object. That's where the owner role comes in. The owner is the only role by default that has the capabilities to do everything that the reader and the contributor can do, but it has the change control of the permissions on the object itself. Now, that's going to be one of those exam type questions: is what is the minimum role that you need to be able to do and fill in the blank? And so yes, the contributor might be able to do it, and yes, the owner could absolutely do it, but if all you need was the read, that's the one as a minimum role that you're going to work with. Now, you could even take the general read role and come into a very specific read role, what I'll call custom, and I'll show that as we go through this. Now, I'm going to zoom in, and I said I'll show some of this just from a time perspective. It's easier to do it in the non-graphical interface. And so what I'm now getting into is to the access control. I'm still on the management group, and I'm coming into the various types of roles. And there's that owner, contributor, and reader, those 3 right there that I've defined. And they talk about basically what I just mentioned: grants full access to manage the resources, including the ability to assign roles and RBAC permissions. And you're going to see the contributor role, but does not allow them to assign that RBAC permission. And the reader can only consume the resources. Now, when you click on the view, and I'll do some of this in the portal, what it then does is it comes in, and so in this case, the owner role has almost 19,000 different permissions that are being assigned to it. And they range from other, read, write. So there's this collection across the totality of Azure for things at the subscription level, the domain services level. You write an OU container. So there are potentially thousands of permissions that make up a role. So don't think that roles are permissions. They are a grouping of permissions that you're working with. Now, when you take a look at, and we talked about the difference between the account management side, the identity management, and the resource management, what we're going to see when we go back to the PowerPoint slide is you're seeing from a resource group versus the management group or the identities that you're working with. You're going to see that they all have reader, owner, contributor, reader, owner, contributor, but now I'm taking a look at here resources, Azure Kubernetes services, all the actual resources. Over here, you're looking at administrative roles around user accounts. Can you create groups? Can you create users? Can you change the properties on the users? So these become that splitting of the different types of roles, whether they are for user account management or for resource management. So let's go back to the slides. Here they're describing for you that separation between the RBAC roles for Azure resources versus the identity management roles for the management of the user accounts. I do want to call out a couple of the special accounts. There's a role called the Global Administrator, or the GA. It is Microsoft's strong recommendation that very few individuals should ever have that capability. Now, in fact, we have a thing called a broken glass scenario. We have a whole set of documentation around how to protect it. So if you're an administrator, I'd strongly encourage you to read that information. So very few people, if any at all, in your organization should have the GA capability. And so that as a global administrator, that becomes a locked away account that only on specific occasions and usually under tight controls does that ever get brought out. You want to find one of the other various roles that we've created for you to be able to do the level of management. Don't go to the top level because it could potentially create some security issues for you. When you take a look at what actually happens inside of Azure, basically takes up those three bubbles I talked about: the who, the identity, the what, the role that there's going to be assigned, and then the where. And so what you now have is what's called a role definition. And that role becomes what I showed you in that one owner role that had 19,000 different permissions. That would actually be identified in a JSON document that looks like, in this case, a JSON document that describes what are called actions and not actions. Now, as a general statement, I've said certain things like child objects inherit things from their parent. I've showed you where that happens and where it doesn't in other recordings. Another general rule that we have is permissions are cumulative with the exception of a deny. So if you don't have any permissions at all, you don't have any permissions to do anything. So by not giving you any permissions, you don't have to worry about it. So some people say, oh, I should go in and make sure that you can't do something. No, just don't give them the permissions. And the term that you'll hear in the documentation is secure by default. Azure by default is secure that no one, except the global administrators, have access to do anything. And you have to open the system up, which is very different from the old security models that we used to have of Windows Server, where by default the model was very open and you had to lock it down. Now that's changed over a period of time. I don't know if any of you remember the early days of Windows Server. The default permission was everyone full control. Literally anybody could have access to everything. Now over time with Windows Server 2008, we locked that down a bit and it didn't become, everyone full control. It became, authenticated users had full control. With Windows Server 2012 R2, we came out with authenticated users had read permissions. And so we started locking things down over time and left that rest of the work to you. In Azure, that fundamentally flipped. We reset the script. By default, it is secure by default. No one has access anywhere except for the global administrators, and you have to start opening the system up. This is the time to stop following those old practices. Only allocate the roles that you need to give the minimum amount of permissions needed to perform a specific activity. Do not over-provision. So those become your actions. Give them the lowest level role that they need to be able to do something. Now, permissions are cumulative with the exception of a deny. So if you get group membership, and we talked about this in another recording, let's say you're a member of two different groups. One group gave you read-write, and one gave you read-write-delete. So your permissions are cumulative. So you have read-write, read-write, and delete. You have the three permissions, with the exception of deny. So if you belong to a group, now I'm going to use an example of HR. The HR manager has read-write capability to every single file in the HR directory. HR users have read permissions to everything in the directory. So as an HR user group, they are assigned maybe the read-write or the read capabilities. As the manager, you're going to get read-write. Well, that's great. Can you think of one file that you might not want the HR manager to have read-write capabilities to? Let's think about that for a second. Maybe their own file. So instead of having to go through and manage everything, what I could now do is to come in and put the HR manager in a deny role, assign that role to their file, so that now, even though the manager has read, write, and delete capabilities across all files, they are also a member of a group that had an exclusion of a not action, so they can't delete. the delete overrides any of the allow permissions that they're working with. So that's how that's going to work. So think about, the actions versus not actions as defined within the JSON document that makes up the role definitions you're working with. And here's another example of what I was drawing for you, the security principles. This becomes the who. The role definition becomes the what. And there's a thing called an assignment. You assign the security principle to the role definition then gets assigned to the scope. That definition, along with the other rules that I've given you of permissions are cumulative with the exception of deny, will determine what the effective capability that user, through their group memberships and role assignments, what they will be able to do to a resource. So what you're seeing on this slide is a different representation, what I've been showing in this and other recordings on the vertical level. I showed that for below the tenant, you had on the right-hand side, you had your identity management services and your resource management on that left-hand side. They're doing the same thing here, but they're showing you in a hierarchical structure. Realistically, you have to have an identity created on that right-hand side before you're able to do anything at the resource level. But they are different sets of roles. Remember, there's a whole set of roles that you'll see on the identity side to manage role capabilities versus the roles that are assigned at the resource side. So you get a resource, an identity created. You take a set of roles that are assigned to it at the resource in Enter ID to manage the identity. You then assign them a role inside of RBAC to be able to then exercise that capability against resources. And then you see that inheritance from parent to child, from management groups down to subscriptions, down to the resource groups, down to the resource themselves. So let's go off and do a demonstration of that in the portal. So I'm back in the portal, and I'm going to come to the Enter ID component first, and we're going to take a look at a set of the roles. Now, there's several different ways you can do this. I'm going to come to the roles and administration, and you're going to get a view of all of the roles that are defined. Attack payload author, application developer. Again, a set of roles that have been defined inside of Entra ID. When I go and compare this, which I tried to do on this, the whiteboard, try and show the list of them, you'll see that they're considerably different. Some roles may look like they're defined with the same name, but they are two different scopes in which those roles are going to take activities on. I can come in and take a look at the description, and it gives you the specific role permissions that you're seeing. Again, just a slightly different look than another one that I'm going to do in just a few minutes. So it talks about I've got different read roles to different specific resources. And into some role settings. I'm going to come back to a user. I want to get into role assignments. And it's in here that I can add an assignment. And in a lab, they have you actually do some of this where you can get into a membership role. Again, we try not to assign them to the users themselves. You do it by getting a role. So I'm going to select one of the predefined roles. Yeah, administrator. What scope do I want this to happen to? And you'll see that it's only at the directory level because this is a directory services role. It can only be scoped to the directory. Now I'm going to change this. I'm going to take that same user and or group, and I'm going to go to a resource management. So I'm going to come into this case, a resource group. I'm going to come to the access control, IAM or RBAC. That's that one area that I can now get into a role assignments. I can see the roles that are assigned. There's a deny assignment. I'm going to come in and do a custom role first. And this is where you're going to see the actual long definition of the RBAC roles for resource management. I'm going to create a custom role, Bob Demo. And I'm going to clone it based on an existing role, or I can start from scratch. Probably not what you're going to want to do. I'm going to select one of the pre-built roles. I'm going to grab that owner role. And this is where I can take a look at the actual permissions that are going to make up that role. Now, one of the things that you can work with across the various resource providers, now I showed you in a previous recording, all the various resource providers on that ARM layer are the things that you can actually use to gain access to the resources. And so these become a wide range of the Azure services, and then you can actually take a look at the roles to that specific service. I think I showed this in the slides, that you saw the breakdown of the roles for Arc servers and Kubernetes services that broke it up. I could do that same thing here. And so for this service, you can see that I've got reads and writes to the resource provider itself. I showed this in another recording, but by default, remember that RBAC permissions are inherited from the parent. And in this case, I'm looking at a resource group which has above it a subscription, and above that it has the management groups. And you can see that reflected in these different roles. So here's the owner role, and it's got this user taking an owner role from the root as well as from the subscription. So it's actually repeating it, so you're not going to get anything different. But it would potentially impact you that if you remove Juliet, in this case, from the tenant root, but not remove it from the subscription, they would still have that high-level capability as owner because they're getting it from multiple locations, from multiple assignments. You remove the assignment from the tenant root, you're going to still potentially have that user have access because they got it from a lower level as well. So RBAC, or the Role-Based Access Control, also known as IAM, Identity Access Management, and Access Control, so those three terms are collectively the same thing, and they are ways for us to control, using this modern method, to gain access to resources inside of Azure. They're broken up into the two major groups of identity management and a set of roles for that, and a set of roles for resource management. The same general rules of permissions are cumulative with the exception of a deny, and we saw that in the role assignment of actions and non-actions. And so you can actually override that if you have a deny or a not action, if there is an action that has been granted through another membership or role, it would then be overwritten with that effective permission having the deny take away, or the not action, the permission that was granted through other roles. So with that, remember that you're going to now use the minimum amount, because by default, Azure is secure by default. You have to open the system up, and we want to make sure that we're only provisioning with the necessary permissions to do the minimum set of capabilities without over-provisioning or giving more capabilities than what most users expect. Thanks for joining us for this session. To continue your learning, watch other videos in the course or explore more on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn.